Most people think clean water comes from somewhere, a mountain, a reservoir, a pristine lake. It doesn't. In many cities, the water coming out of your tap has already been through someone else's toilet, then through a treatment plant, then back into the system, sometimes more than once. And the way we clean it, the system protecting billions of people, was designed when the Model T was still new. It was built to stop cholera, not microplastics, not PFAS, not pharmaceuticals, not the chemical reality of modern life. And yet we still use it. Not because there is no better option, because replacing old systems is harder than building better ones. Here is something the water industry does not advertise. Even as standards continue to evolve, legal drinking water can still contain trace contaminants that current treatment was not designed to catch. The standard for safe drinking water was written decades ago, when we did not have the tools to detect what was in it. Since then, we have discovered that municipal water systems across the developed world contain trace levels of pharmaceuticals, PFAS, so-called forever chemicals, microplastics, agricultural runoff, and heavy metals that current treatment does not fully remove. The EPA has begun designating some of these as priority concerns, and PFAS limits now exist for certain compounds, but the regulatory framework is still catching up to the science. The standard treatment process works like this: take raw water, add chlorine to kill bacteria, run it through sand filters to pull out large particles, sometimes add fluoride and call it done. That system was designed for the threats of the 1900s. Cholera, typhoid, bacteria you can see under a microscope. It was not designed for the threats of right now. To understand why, you need to understand where the system came from, because this is not a story about incompetence. It is a story about a solution that worked brilliantly for its moment and then refused to leave. In the late 1800s, waterborne disease was the leading cause of death in most American cities. Cholera outbreaks killed thousands at a time. Typhoid was endemic. Cities were growing faster than anyone knew how to manage, and the rivers and reservoirs they drew drinking water from were the same places they dumped waste. Then chlorination arrived. On September 26, 1908, Jersey City, New Jersey became the first city in the United States to begin continuous chlorination of its municipal water supply. The man behind it was a physician named John Leal, who had 99 days to design and build the system from scratch. He did it. Within a decade, thousands of cities had followed. By 1920, the typhoid fever rate in the United States had fallen by roughly 2/3 from its 1900 levels, alongside broader sanitation improvements that together transformed public health. Chlorination didn't just save lives. It ended an entire category of suffering so completely that people forgot it had ever existed. And because it worked so well, the infrastructure built around it, including the plants, the pipes, the chemical suppliers, and the regulatory bodies, became permanent, not by design, by success. The problem is that the threats changed and the system didn't. PFAS, perfluoroalkyl substances, were introduced into manufacturing in the 1940s. They are in non-stick cookware, firefighting foam, food packaging, and waterproof clothing. They do not break down, they accumulate in tissue. The Environmental Protection Agency has linked them to kidney cancer, thyroid disease, immune dysfunction, and developmental problems in children. And they pass straight through conventional treatment systems because conventional treatment was built for bacteria, not synthetic chemistry. Microplastics were barely a concept when the modern treatment framework was codified. Pharmaceutical compounds were not tested for. The regulatory framework that defines safe water in most countries still does not require testing for hundreds of synthetic compounds we now produce by the billions of tons annually. Here is what that actually means in practice. There are communities in the United States, not in the developing world, not in conflict zones, where residents have been told not to drink the tap water for years. Flint, Michigan is the name everyone knows, but Flint is not an anomaly. It is a symptom. There are hundreds of water systems across the country with lead levels exceeding federal action thresholds, serving millions of people who either do not know or who have been told it is being handled. PFAS contamination from military bases and industrial sites has reached groundwater supplies in dozens of states. In some agricultural regions, nitrate levels from fertilizer runoff have made tap water unsafe for infants. And here is what makes it worse. In most of these places, officials knew. The data existed. The testing had been done. The response was slow, not because the problem was hidden, but because fixing it meant admitting the system had failed. And admitting the system had failed meant political cost, legal liability, and budget pressure that nobody wanted to absorb. So the patches kept coming, and the core assumptions kept going unquestioned. To be clear, for most Americans, tap water remains dramatically safer than the alternatives. The system works, just not well enough, and not for everyone. The contamination problem is real and growing, and it is concentrated precisely in the communities least equipped to fight it. These are not edge cases. They are the predictable output of a system running decades past its design parameters. Meanwhile, according to figures from the World Health Organization and the United Nations, roughly 2 billion people lack access to reliably safe drinking water. Not no water, but water they cannot depend on to be clean. The conventional treatment approach, building large centralized plants, running chemical supply chains and maintaining aging infrastructure, is too expensive, too fragile and too slow to scale to the places that need it most. The cities of the developing world are growing at a rate the centralized model cannot match, and a plant designed to serve 500,000 people costs hundreds of millions of dollars and takes a decade to build. By the time it opens, the city has grown to 800,000. The infrastructure is always behind. And here is the part worth sitting with. We have technology that could help do this better. We have had it for decades. The reason it is not everywhere yet has less to do with whether it works, and more to do with where it works best, and how hard old systems are to replace. Your phone battery works by moving ions between two electrodes. Charge it, and ions migrate in one direction. Drain it, and they migrate back. In the 1960s, two researchers asked a simple question. What if you use that same principle to pull salt out of water instead of storing energy? Run water between two electrodes, apply a small charge. The ions lock onto the surfaces. The water that comes out the other end has significantly less salt in it. Reverse the charge, flush the ions away, and do it again. This is called capacitive deionization. No chemicals, no high-pressure pumps, no membranes degrading on a replacement schedule. Just electricity. Electricity you can generate from a solar panel in a village with no municipal infrastructure at all. Compare that to reverse osmosis, the current gold standard for desalination. Reverse osmosis forces water through a membrane at 50 to 80 times atmospheric pressure. It works, but the machinery is industrial, the membrane's foul and need replacing, and it rejects roughly half the water it processes as concentrated brine waste. Half gone. In a world where 2 billion people don't have enough, CDI uses a fraction of that energy, produces a fraction of that waste, and can be built small enough to serve a single building or a single village. The physics does not care about scale. For brackish and lower salinity water sources which describe the contamination problem for a significant portion of the world, peer-reviewed research consistently shows CDI operating at a fraction of the energy cost of reverse osmosis. That's the core idea. The engineering to fully deliver on it is still catching up, but the principle has been proven since 1960. The early systems had a real problem. The electrodes were slow to saturate and slow to regenerate, which limited flow rates and made them impractical at meaningful scale. The principle could be proven, but you could not build a water treatment plant around it. Then materials science caught up. The breakthrough was activated carbon, specifically carbon with a surface area so enormous it defies intuition. 1 gram of the material used in modern electrodes can have a surface area of up to 1,000 square meters. That is more than 10 tennis courts in a piece of material you could hold between 2 fingers. Activated carbon changed the game. Think of it like a sponge. A flat sheet of the same material holds almost no water. The sponge holds a lot because of its internal surface area, all those tiny pockets and channels. Activated carbon does the same thing for ions. The more surface area, the more ions the electrode can hold before it needs to regenerate. The more ions it holds, the more water you can treat per hour. Surface area matters. Researchers have since moved from generic activated carbon to carbon nanotubes, graphene-based electrodes and hybrid materials that combine high surface area with faster ion transport. Each generation pushes energy efficiency higher and regeneration time lower. Efficiency improves with each step. A decade ago, capacitive deionization, called CDI, was mostly a lab result. Today it handles thousands of litres, regeneration takes minutes instead of hours, and costs keep falling. Technology adoption does not wait for perfection, it waits for good enough at the right price. And CDI is getting there faster than most people realise. Today, scale is increasing. More recently, researchers started using flow electrode systems, where the electrode material itself is a slurry that flows through the system. The carbon particles carry the ions away, get regenerated in a separate chamber, and flow back in. Continuous operation, no downtime. A system you can run around the clock. Continuous operation is a major benefit. That is a significant shift. First generation CDI was a batch process, treat, regenerate. Flow electrode CDI is continuous, which means it can begin to match the throughput demands of larger facilities. CDI selectivity is one of its most interesting properties. Unlike reverse osmosis, which blocks essentially everything above a certain size, CDI can be tuned to preferentially remove specific ions. Researchers are testing CDI-based systems for targeted contaminants like nitrates, heavy metals, and some emerging pollutants, but this is still application-specific work. The results, according to the peer-reviewed literature, are promising. It is not a solved problem across the board yet. This is working technology being deployed right now in the applications where it fits best. In South Korea, CDI systems run in industrial water treatment facilities, handling process water at scale as operational infrastructure rather than pilot programs. In the United States, agricultural startups are deploying CDI to treat irrigation water contaminated with nitrates and heavy metals, protecting both crops and the groundwater downstream. In India, early-stage deployments are treating fluoride-contaminated groundwater in rural communities, where centralized infrastructure does not exist, and will not for decades. Fluoride contamination affects an estimated 200 million people globally, and conventional treatment, even where it exists, does almost nothing to address it. CDI can target fluoride specifically, making it well-suited to communities where that is the primary contamination risk. Perhaps the most urgent deployments are happening in sub-Saharan Africa. Research groups working with local partners have piloted solar-powered CDI units small enough to fit in a shipping container. Systems that can provide clean water for a village of several hundred people, running entirely off renewable energy with no chemical supply chain, no specialized maintenance staff, and no connection to a municipal grid that does not exist. For communities that have been waiting generations for infrastructure that keeps being promised and keeps not arriving, this is not an incremental improvement, it is a category change. Think about what that means operationally. No chlorine truck, no engineer on call, no grid connection that goes down and stays down, and a system that runs on sunlight. That's what makes it different. And the economics case is shifting fast. In agricultural deployments specifically, capacitive deionization, CDI, is already cost competitive with the alternative, which in many cases is not reverse osmosis. It is doing nothing and absorbing the crop losses and liability that come with contaminated irrigation water. When the comparison is not CDI versus a state-of-the-art treatment plant, but CDI versus contaminated groundwater and no other option, the economics are not even close. That is the market CDI is winning right now, and it is a large market. Agriculture represents enormous economic activity that is directly exposed to water quality risk. CDI does not need to capture all of it. It needs to keep capturing more of it than it did last year. Voltaire, a Texas-based company, has deployed CDI systems commercially across agriculture, food, beverage, and industrial sectors for nearly 2 decades. That matters because most breakthrough technologies die between the lab and the real world. CDI did not. It made it into the field. These successes are real, but they remain concentrated in specific applications where CDI's strengths align precisely with the problem. The question is why that range is not expanding faster. Three things are slowing it down, and they compound each other. The first is infrastructure lock-in. Every city in the developed world has already spent billions on centralized treatment plants, pipes, chemical supply networks, and regulatory frameworks built around chlorination. Replacing any part of that system is not just a capital investment, it is a political fight. The people who built the current system, who operate it, who regulate it, have every incentive to defend it. That is not a conspiracy. It is how institutions work. Consider what it would actually take to switch a major city's water treatment to a CDI-based system. You would need to retrain the workforce, rewrite the regulatory standards, redesign the testing protocols, renegotiate the chemical supply contracts, justify the capital expenditure to a city council that does not understand the technology and has no political incentive to champion it. And you would be doing all of that while the current system, flawed as it is, still works well enough that most people in the developed world turn on the tap without thinking twice. That is the trap of good enough. The current system is not good enough to solve the water problem, but it is good enough that the people with the power to change it do not feel the urgency to do so. The United States alone has an estimated 2.2 million miles of water pipes, many approaching or past their design lifespan. Every dollar committed to maintaining that existing network is a dollar not available for rethinking what sits at the other end of it. Lock-in is not a decision anyone made. It is the accumulated weight of a million smaller decisions, each individually rational, collectively a wall. The people who feel the urgency do not have the political power to force the change. The second is a performance gap at scale. CDI is genuinely competitive at small and medium scales, for example, household systems, building level filtration, and village scale deployment in the developing world. At city scale, and especially for seawater, reverse osmosis and conventional treatment still hold real advantages. It is worth being specific about where the gap actually lies. For brackish water, which is the contamination profile for the majority of the world's at-risk groundwater, CDI is already highly competitive on energy and cost. The challenge is throughput. Moving from systems that handle thousands of litres per day to systems that handle millions of litres per day requires engineering advances that are actively being worked on but are not fully solved. That is a meaningful constraint. It is also a constraint that looked far more insurmountable a decade ago than it does today. The trajectory matters as much as the current position. CDI's sweet spot right now is precisely where the stakes are highest. The village without a water supply, the agricultural region with nitrate-contaminated groundwater, the building that wants to treat its own water on site. It does not need to beat reverse osmosis at every scale to matter. It needs to keep doing what it is already doing, reaching the places the large-scale model has always skipped. The third is regulatory invisibility. CDI has not become a mainstream drinking water treatment pathway in EPA-style regulatory frameworks. It does not feature in standard treatment technique approvals or mainstream municipal procurement processes. That is not a judgment on the technology. It is a reflection of how slowly regulatory systems absorb alternatives to entrenched approaches. The consequences of that slowness are not abstract. Every year, CDI sits outside the regulatory mainstream is another year in which municipal procurement officers default to the approved list. Another year, development bank funding flows to centralized infrastructure rather than distributed alternatives. Another year, the communities most in need are told to wait for a system built for a different era. What makes this particularly self-reinforcing is that the regulatory invisibility feeds on itself. Without regulatory approval, large utilities will not adopt CDI. Without large utility adoption, there is no pressure on regulators to evaluate it. Without regulatory evaluation, the approval never comes. The loop closes, and the people outside that loop, the ones drinking contaminated water, The ones with no water at all wait. Consider what waiting actually costs. A child drinking nitrate-contaminated water for the first 5 years of life. A farming community absorbing crop losses from irrigation water, nobody treated. A city where waterborne illness fills hospitals, not because we lack the knowledge to prevent it, but because the approved solution is too expensive and the better one has not been approved. The regulatory gap is not abstract. It has a body count. That loop has broken before. It broke for UV disinfection. It broke for membrane bioreactors that are now standard in advanced wastewater treatment. Each time the pattern was the same: growing evidence, early adopters, a crisis that made the status quo indefensible, and then finally movement. The question for CDE is not whether that loop will break. It is what it will take and how many people will be failed in the meantime. The science is no longer the question. The question is whether institutions can move fast enough to matter. So what does this actually look like if it gets the traction it deserves? Not tearing out existing infrastructure overnight. That is not realistic, and it is not necessary. It looks like solar-powered units deployed across rural Africa and South Asia, providing clean water to communities that have been waiting for conventional infrastructure for 50 years, and will wait 50 more if nothing changes. It looks like agricultural CDI becoming standard practice in farming regions where nitrate contamination has made groundwater dangerous. It looks like building level water treatment reducing demand on aging municipal systems designed for half the population now using them. The cost curve keeps falling, the deployment record keeps lengthening, the evidence base keeps growing. At some point, and that point may be closer than it appears, the cost of defending the old system will exceed the cost of changing it. The real water crisis was never just scarcity, it was infrastructure. We built a system for a biological problem and kept using it for a chemical one. That system saved millions of lives, but it was built for a world that no longer exists. Now we have an alternative, not perfect, not universal, but real and already working. The next time someone tells you the water crisis is about scarcity, ask them why we are still using the same treatment approach we built when the Model T was new. The answer is not a conspiracy. It is less dramatic than that, and in some ways more stubborn. Old pipes, old plants, old budgets, old rules. Inertia does not need villains, it just needs nobody to push back hard enough. If this raised questions you had not thought to ask before, subscribe and drop a comment below. Would you trust this technology over your current municipal supply? I want to know where you actually land.